Welcome back everyone, it's me, Matsmus, and thank you for joining me today. We are going back to talking about tracked vehicles. Thank God it's been a while since we've talked about tanks, really, isn't it? And today we are talking about the Sheridan, the M551. The cute ditzy little tank that you think isn't really much in terms of capability, but overall it has quite a powerful little bite to it, and it's not something you would really want to mess with back in its era when it was actually deployed. So we're going to talk about the vehicle overall, and there's quite a bit of history to this vehicle, so please bear with me. Following 3 years of budget negotiations and roughly 1 year of preparations, limited production of the M551 was produced in 1966, with the production variant more or less based on the 12th prototype. The earlier prototypes served mostly to verify various technical solutions. The M551 was officially accepted in service in May of 1966, and was the first vehicle to arrive on an operational unit christened General Frank S. Besson Jr., the commander of the Army Material Command, as M551 General Sheridan, named after the famous Civil War General Philip Henry Sheridan. The vehicle was mass-produced between 1962 and 1970, with 1,662 made in total. There are a lot of these things, folks. The tank was immediately submitted to a series of tests in various different climates, and it was found out that even in a human environment, the Shillelagh missile was actually quite functional. The same, however, could not be said about the semi-combustible casings of the 152mm shells. They often got damp, which resulted in many failures. Another issue was the fact that since the barrel was actually quite short, it had no fume extractor, and the crew compartment often became filled with gunpowder residue and gases, regardless of the fact that the turret ventilation intake was located straight above the breech. I can tell you this much, taking in gunpowder fumes is just not a good time. It can make you dizzy, sick, and will reduce the capability of the crew very quickly. To make things even worse, hot remnants of the semi-combustible casings remained in the barrel, and there was always a danger of the loaded ammunition spontaneously combusting as you loaded it. To remedy this last issue, Sheridans were equipped from February 1967 with the so-called open breech scavenger system, the purpose of which was to flush the inside of the barrel with a compressed air, removing all the residue potentially left inside from the last firing. The compressed air was stored in a laminate pressure container installed on the front of the driver's seat, and they were pressurized for about 3100 psi, which is a ton of pressure, folks! This was produced by a compressor located under the seat itself. 3 different versions of the system existed in production, and to the amusement of maintenance crews, it was generally not a very efficient solution anyway and didn't even work. Some of the sparks would still stay inside there even if you blow 3100 psi at it. The worst testing results came from the trials that took place in 1967 in the human environment of Panama. During one of the tests, one loaded shell exploded while the gun breech was open. The explosion was the result of the above-mentioned issue with the hot residue staying inside the barrel, and as a result, the crews and workers were now forbidden to store ammunition in the tanks themselves, and the production was temporarily stopped. This happened after the OBSS system was installed, leading to its replacement by the closed breech scavenger system in 1968, which improved the safety of the whole firing mechanism significantly. There were tests performed in Australia which showed pretty much similar results, and the general conclusion was that while the vehicle was not suitable for human environments and dry and cold environments, it still worked just fine. These warnings, however, were not disregarded, and the first combat use of the Sheridan would indeed take place in Vietnam. The Sheridan deployed in Vietnam was a chapter unto itself. The vehicle was actually designed for the battlefields of Europe and to fight the Soviets and their mechanized infantry tactics. The Soviet APCs or IFVs carrying infantry were to be the primary targets. Basically, it would be a case-by-case event where a BMP would take on a Sheridan because that's primarily what they would be used for, dropping off infantry and engaging with their anti-tank missiles. And the Sheridan should be the one that should go and take them out. It has the Shillelagh, it has the 152mm heat gun, it would be perfect for taking out these vehicles. However, in Vietnam, these just weren't a thing. The tactic was not suitable for the asymmetric warfare in Vietnam, and the new shell was required in order to deal with enemy foot soldiers. The result was the need for the XM625 Beehive flechette round. Filled with 9,900 nail-sized needle shards, it could quite literally tear any infantry caught in the open into pieces. Another modification for Vietnam battlefields were the commander's post on top of the turret. This received an additional protection and the 50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, which provided a protective gun shield. As a result, the commander was somewhat protected from the front by that shield, but from the sides, where the open parts were, there was really no additional protection for them. Some vehicles were modified even further by adding an additional machine gun for the loader, or even a mortar or grenade launcher. The deployment to Vietnam uncovered further issues the vehicle had, some of which took years to remedy. The transmission, for example, was insufficient for the weight and power of the vehicle, and the drivers had to be very careful with the clutch, otherwise there was a real danger of completely ruining the transmission. This was especially a problem in two specific cases. Funnily enough, the first instance is with the drivers. They were used to the M48 Patton tank where they could treat the clutch very roughly. Unfortunately, not so much in this vehicle. The second instance is when the transmission was under unusual stresses or high workloads. Prime example, was that the Sheridans were leading the way through the jungles, and the amount of foliage that they were churning through in the mud made it very difficult for the transmissions to last, unlike the following M113s behind them that could deal with it quite well. The fragile and improper construction of the RPM limiter led to various failures as well, stalling the engine or allowing the RPM to run too high and damaging it. The turret was also a nightmare, and to this day it's still currently considered to be one of the worst weapon systems ever to be used in the US Army, and in my personal opinion I can't really agree with that. I think it had a great concept, but I think from a design perspective, for those who used it, it was not the greatest. Describing the pleasure of fighting in a real Sheridan hardly does it justice, so let's just talk a little bit about the examples of issues that turret crews used to face. In regular tanks, overpressure in the recoil hydraulics usually resulted in busted seals, which were not really that too hard to replace. In the Sheridan, however, such overpressure was theoretically prevented by a valve screw that, however, quite failed often, resulting in the turret being pretty much showered by red hydraulic fluid, which to me is hilarious, and they nicknamed it being cherry juiced. Another source of constant irritation for the crews was the wiring of the turret. The main circuits were distributed to 10 removable separate circuit boards. The problem was that the violent recoil of the gun often shook them out of their beds, resulting in various electrical failures and short circuits. Given the fact that the gun was fired by an electric mechanism, such a failure was possibly disastrous for the vehicle, especially in a combat situation. This is very, very scary stuff. Other things like carbon residue from the semi-combustible casings got stuck to the electrical wiring in the gun firing mechanism, significantly reducing its reliability. These issues were far from rare. They sometimes appeared even after 2 or 3 shots, and the average Sheridan crews reported 1 gun failure per 50 shots. That's pretty much 1 failure per half the ammo storage that you have available to your vehicle. The proverbial cherry on the top was the firing of the full charge high explosive and high explosive anti-tank ammunition from the gun. The beehive rounds, although sounded fantastic, were relatively fine because they used a reduced charge, but when firing the full HE or heat rounds, the vehicle shook so violently and its front road wheels were actually thrown up in the air by the recoil while the tank was temporarily covered by a thick cloud of smoke because the barrel was so close to the vehicle. This negatively influenced the Shillelagh missile targeting system, and after firing a few regular rounds, it was problematic to actually launch the missile or really hit anything. The loader had the possibility of being the worst in crew position. Operating the breech itself was not exactly easy, as the electric part of the breech failed for reasons mentioned that I already said, and it had to be opened manually using a crank. Operating this crank was difficult, to say the least, in a cramped turret like the Sheridan, and the loaders hated it with a passion. It was also very important for the loader not to forget to switch to gun mode when firing a regular round, if the last round was fired as a missile. If he forgot to do that, the missile launch mechanism would rip the side of the shell combustible case open, and the gunpowder granules would spill on the turret and would pretty much cover the floor. Of course, the missile rounds were no better either. They were large and extremely difficult to manipulate inside the turret. As well, there were issues with unfired rounds getting sometimes stuck inside the barrel. Literally, getting stuck halfway down the barrel. Finally, a rather nasty flaw was when the gun was elevated to its maximum position, for some reason the turret just started randomly rotating left to the undisclosed floor. The gunners were really not amused. Most of these issues were solved and fixed throughout its service, but it's really detrimental for a vehicle like this to have so many problems coming out as release. To trace the roots of the vehicle, the Sheridan lineage can be brought back to the M41 Walker Bulldog and needed to be replaced very quickly. The Bulldog was a solid American light tank, but as much more of a Soviet heavy tank started appearing in the mess. In terms of this vehicle's history, the Sheridan lineage can be traced back to the M41 Walker Bulldog that needed to be replaced. The Bulldog was a solid American light tank, but as more Soviet heavier tanks started appearing in American reports, it was clear that the 76mm gun was no longer capable of dealing with the newest Soviet medium tanks. The Bulldog entered service in 1953, but soon after in 1954, the US Army started developing many different replacements. Some of these vehicles were rather interesting, including the T-92 light tank, a 17-ton experimental vehicle. It was equipped with a 76mm high-powered gun and a 340 horsepower engine. It was tested a lot between 1956 and 58, but ultimately the design was not successful. It had two major flaws. For one, it was undergunned, and the 76mm gun was no longer considered sufficient to deal with the threats of vehicles that it may encounter. The second major flaw was the vehicle was not amphibious and could not be modified to swim. They were even looking at potential for these vehicles to be thrown out the back of aircraft, which, as you know with the Sheridan, was something quite prominent. In the late 50s, it was clear that the 76mm gun would no longer do any of the frontal-sloped armour of Soviet designs. Ever since, in 1958, the Ford company was developing a new weapon system, considering that there was a 152mm gun on the drawing boards. The M81 gun launcher, capable of firing the M151 Sheridan missile. The entire launcher was very light, since the charge needed to be launching the missile was quite small, and therefore there was no real need for mechanisms that were too sturdy. The recoil was supposed to be very low, allowing the system to be used on a relatively light chassis. At that point, the missile warhead offered enough firepower to destroy any enemy vehicles that it would encounter on the battlefield up to around 4 kilometers, which meant that the light tank equipped could actually destroy enemy tanks at distances far beyond their own gun ranges. The theoretical minimal range for this missile was somewhere between 75 and 100 meters, with the minimal truly effective range being estimated at 1,000 meters. But that was, at least in theory, not a problem, as shootouts with enemy or medium tanks at less than 1 kilometer were considered pretty much suicidal anyway. But the missile was, of course, only effective against armoured targets. The gun had to be capable of firing high explosive rounds as well. Fortunately, it wasn't a huge problem, considering that the HE rounds needed less muzzle velocity than anything else. It was completely fine to simply fire them with reduced charges, just like the missiles. Once the US Army had a gun selected, they started looking for something to put the gun on. As usual for most different procurements, the Army had a contradictory set of demands that included frontal hull protection against Soviet vehicles from 14.5mm shells, frontal turret protection against Soviet 20mm shells, amphibious capability, gas protection, night fighting capability, transportation by air, and maximum mobility in terrain. That's a pretty heavy Christmas list right there, folks. There are a couple more demands, and in the end, Cadillac GM proposed as one of the best at going for the contract. In addition to the project viability, Cadillac also had tank production plants in Cleveland, where 600 qualified workers were assembling the last of the Walker Bulldogs. The Cadillac proposed was powered by a Detroit diesel 6V53T engine. The engine code basically means 6 cylinders, V-shaped cylinder configuration, 53 is the volume of one cylinder in cubic inches, and the T means turbocharged, which produced 300 horsepower at 2,800 RPM. In order to keep the power-to-weight ratio at sufficient levels, the developers opted for an aluminum hull instead of the classic steel to save weight. The dimensions of the vehicle were further constrained by the maximum allowable dimensions that could be carried by army transport planes, and therefore unfortunately made it completely impossible for the vehicle to be amphibious. It just didn't have the displacement, so it did not tick that objective. They would have to put rubber floaters on it to make it float. The project received its designation the Armoured Reconnaissance Airborne Assault Vehicle, or ARAAV, in 1960 and 1961, and the turret was given with the prototype the 152mm XM81 gun, which was trialled on the M41 Walker Bulldog with the suspension for the Shillelagh firing trials. The XM81 development was actually delayed as well due to the MBT-70 debacle, and the Cleveland plant was actually under threat of closing for some time. The gap between the M41 and the future vehicle was very difficult for them to maintain. Before it was saved by the contract to produce the M114 howitzers, luckily the plant did not close. The Army ordered 6 prototypes in 1960, and the vehicle was actually prepared quite quickly for the project. At that point, it was the first prototype that was ready later that year, arriving for tests at Fort Knox. They ordered prototypes and increased from 6 to 12, and then finally to 20. The M551, as it's called, was a completely new design and built from scratch, and it caused a lot of issues during its initial prototype assembly, as every prototype does. Yes, there were flaws, many flaws that I already mentioned. The cooling system was also very poor, the engine was constantly overheating, and some of the internal aluminum parts were very fragile and completely breaking apart. This vehicle was just desperate for a new designer. Despite the issues related to the entire Sheridan development and the turret design, the combat results of the vehicle were actually not that bad. Mixed would be the correct word, really, for describing the first impressions of the vehicle from Vietnam. Funnily enough, though, due to the amount of vehicles that they produced, the Sheridans were also deployed in Europe by the time the Vietnam War raged on. Unsurprisingly, the mild climate saw the Sheridan performance improve by quite a bit, especially when it came to reliability. The Sheridan units developed quite effective tactics to deal with the perceived danger of hordes of Soviet armour, hit-and-run style, shoot and scoot. Using superior range of the Shillelagh missile, the M551 would fire 2 or 3 of the missiles at long ranges at around 2,000 meters, and it could really not be threatened by the Soviet tank guns at the time, retreat quickly, leaving the enemy confused and reeling. In 1971, the Sheridans were equipped with a new Ruby Laser AN VVG-1 rangefinder. Such vehicles bore the M551A1 designation. This posed a slight problem for European Sheridans, as during the exercises, the friendly soldiers playing the bad guys could have their sight damaged by the lasers, but this issue was remedied by some rule restrictions when training and for live use. This would obviously not really matter anymore. From 1978 onwards, the phasing out of the Sheridans slowly started, with the active vehicles being replaced either by the M60A1 and the M60A3 tanks, or the M113 APCs, temporarily with the final replacement being the Bradley vehicle family. In the end, the only unit with these vehicles still in service was the 4th Battalion of the 68th Regiment 82nd Airborne Division. The rest of the Sheridans ended up on military scrapyards or on repair plants as the spare parts were sourced for the ones they still had firing. Before its final retirement in 1996, the M551 saw 2 more conflicts: Operation Just Cause, the invasion of Panama, and Operation Desert Storm. In Panama, the Sheridans of the 82nd Airborne were first used to capture the airfield and were airdropped from around the area. Due to bad weather, some Sheridans actually ended up in a swamp. Their crews were quite obviously not amused. The combat use itself, however, was satisfactory. The vehicles were agile and the 152mm HE shells had sufficient demolition power in the city to combat and get rid of entrenched troops. It was, however, the Desert Storm operation that proved to be the final war for the Sheridan. The first 55 vehicles were deployed in the Persian Gulf by 1991, and until the Abrams tanks arrived, they represented the most American firepower on the battlefield at the time. It was here that the missile was used operationally for the first and final time, knocking out an Iraqi Type 59 main battle tank. The vehicles also proved to be quite reliable though, with a proper maintenance here and there. Didn't really save it so much, but it kept it going for the most part. After the war, the Sheridans were also used for a while as OPFOR vehicles. Training units represented them for Soviets on the battlefield during military exercises, which is just a kick in the teeth to the designers. You make a tank that's purely designed to be an enemy. And that was really the role and end for this career of the tank, which ended in 1998. That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed your little history lesson about the Sheridan M551. Really a vehicle that was kind of doomed from the start, and I feel really sad because I think in terms of its concept, it was really trying to think outside the box, a different kind of weapon system that provided a capability that should have been very, very effective at being able to knock out tanks and infantry, fortified positions, the like. Sad to see that it did have such a rough time, but hey, you know, that's what happens when you design things that are really, really intricate. Thank you again for joining me today, folks. I really appreciate you stopping by. Hopefully you enjoyed the footage and my little discussion about this vehicle. If you've ever served on it or know much more about this vehicle, your own experiences, I would love to hear from you. This is one of those vehicles that has had so many problems mechanically and sort of weapon system wise that I'd love to hear your own experiences if you've been around them or you know people who have. Please let me know in the comment section below. Guys, if you wish to support my channel, I'd really appreciate you check out my Patreon page. You're more than welcome to look in the description box there and click on the link. You'll be able to be sent there. I also have my Discord channel if you want to come hang out in there and have a chat. And, of course, Facebook and all that good stuff. If you want to be notified of upcoming videos, please hit the little bell button by the subscribe button so you can be notified of upcoming videos in the future. All the best, folks. Have a great day, and bye-bye.